All right. Thanking God for the way that he can encourage us even in exceedingly difficult times. Let's call Luke chapter 21, your hearts. Understanding that back in chapter 18, he encouraged them to pray without losing heart. He is now going to once again talk about the ends of times. The end of the 80, 70 eras we saw back in Matthew and Mark. And once again, how that reflects the end of all things. This time, the nuance I saw in Luke is the way in which he is telling them to be encouraged and not lose heart. And once again, not to give up on praying, even as things seem to be declining to the point where it might look hopeless. But with that, he's going to start out with the relatively famous story of the widow's offering, giving us a high point, saying that essentially in the first 4 verses, no matter how meager her offering looks, it is actually looked upon favorably by God. However, in the next few verses, he's going to use the temple as an example of something that no matter how regal or impressive it looks, it is now being looked at unfavorably by God, quite possibly because of the character that has been allowed to settle in there, going back to some of the warnings we saw in chapter 20. Leading into the question in verse 7, teacher, when will these things be? The described destruction of the temple. And that when is going to lead him to giving them some instructions as to timing, but the timing is going to go hand in hand with a sort of checklist of signs that they should look for beginning in or about verse 10. But he is not simply giving them this information as we sometimes say, head knowledge. There is a therefore round about verse 13 that will say it will be their opportunity to do certain things. And so when they see these things, it is not a time for them to simply huddle up and start wondering how they can look after whatever it is that they just got going on their personal. No, anyway, you understand that these are his servants. And so he is saying these are signs of them not only to take precautions for their families, but to understand the opportunities that are available for them to do the things that God has called them to do. That checklist continuing on as he will more specifically talk in verses 20 through 24 about the signs specific to the destruction of Jerusalem and how they should respond in that circumstance, and how that is affixed, or how it is a precursor or prerequisite. Either way, it's coming before the signs of his return, or this coming back of the Son of Man. An additional checklist that we'll see in verses 25 through 28 that will also give additional warnings about the times, as he will go on to say that as you understand verses 29 through 33, as you understand how to look at a fig tree and understand the seasons that are approaching, understand that these signs are spiritual examples of the spiritual, or they're physical examples of the spiritual seasons that are approaching, that will then manifest themselves in the physical reality that you'll be dealing with as the destruction of Jerusalem becomes more of a reality. And it also sets in motion the things that will take place, marking his return or his second coming after his crucifixion. As he is going to conclude once again with a practical therefore. Why is he telling them all this? So that they can, in verse 34, as we mentioned in the title, so that they can watch lest their hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and that day come upon them suddenly like a trap. So he will go on to basically talk about what I think got my attention most in this chapter, and that is similar to what we've seen, at least in, I think it was Matthew's account, maybe Mark's, but it's in one of those accounts of the end times. Understanding that this whole concept of the prophecies regarding the ends of Jerusalem and the ends of all things is just consistent throughout the synoptic gospels. And one of them, at least one of them before the way that he's going to describe it here in Luke, is going to say there are practical advantages to not allowing your heart to be weighed down in dissipation, because even in the worst of times, even as God is closing out the ends of an era, even for a nation or for us all, there are still opportunities to make sure that we don't have to endure any worse level of suffering and struggle than God has for us to endure. Going back to what we saw, as we mentioned before, in the land of Goshen, as God was bringing the people of Israel out of Egyptian captivity, there was a land in which his people were given peace and refuge from all of the torment that was falling on their oppressors in Egypt. And so even though, as we've said, the end times have a different look, he does not promise his people a bubble in which he is going to protect them from all of the tragedy that is going to mark the end of all things. But he's telling his people here, as he is talking about both the end of Jerusalem and the end of all things, essentially not to give up, understanding that there is still value in prayer and growing a better understanding of the things that God is willing to do for us, even in the most distressing and seemingly hopeless situations. Reminding me of professional advice or mentorship I got a ways back about understanding the potential in a situation. That was simply described as an illustration I use from time to time, learning to reframe the issue, understanding that in an adversarial circumstance, there are times when your adversary wants to fixate your attention around a set of facts that are most favorable for them. But getting the best out of any situation involves not allowing people to define reality for you, but especially in an adversarial circumstance, learning to reframe the issue around what is possible, not around what especially your adversary would want to define for you. And understanding in the last days, a lot of what God is doing is dealing with the adversary. And one of his most effective tools is getting God's people to buy into the false notion that his future is our future. And so in encouraging his people not to lose heart, one of the things that God seems to be doing to encourage his believers as they face difficult times is to not settle for the picture of life that the enemy has drawn for them, but to let God reframe reality for them, which is why we sometimes say God's best to you as you go forward with him, making the most of the opportunities he still makes available, even in difficult times.